La 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 Liberty Summer Seminar. La 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 Liberty Summer Seminar.
7th Annual Liberty Summer Seminar. This is the 7th year of this event, which, when I think about it, that's a really long time. It's our 2nd year as the Liberty Summer Seminar, hosted by the Institute for Liberal Studies. You can see our nifty logos over here. Ask me about that logo and who designed it later. I designed it. Later. So just a few logistics, and then we'll get started. First of all, please, whatever you do, there's a track over here made by a four-wheeler. Off into that corner is poison ivy. Stay on this side of that track. Okay? So this track right here, just stay on this side towards the pond.
Is that a security device?
What's that?
Is that a security device?
The poison ivy?
Yes.
Yes, it's an anti-burglary device.
He's the guy that did it.
Okay, we have an outhouse just back here. During the night, please don't go wandering into the forest without a flashlight. We've had people wander through that forest for an hour and a half. It's surprising how long you could spend trying to find your way back if you end up in the forest. Okay, good. We'll begin. I'm going to introduce one of the directors of the Institute for Liberal Studies. His name is Matt Buffton. Matt, come on up and introduce our first speaker.
All right, thanks, Peter. Yeah, great to see everybody out here. Thanks again for coming out. Perfect weather. I think it's a 0% chance of rain this year. That'll probably change through the afternoon, but it's looking pretty good for right now. Our first speaker is going to be Karen Selick, who has spoken at this event before. If you were here a couple of years ago, you may have seen her. She's also spoken at Fraser Institute events and many of these type of things. She's a regular contributor to Canadian Lawyer magazine and to the Western Standard. Any of you who subscribe to that may have seen her epic battles with Michael Corrin, in which she always points out why the libertarian idea is superior to the other point of view. She's appeared in other publications like the Globe and Mail, the Fraser Forum, the National Post, and her professional life is a lawyer with Reynolds O'Brien in Belleville, Ontario. Please join me in welcoming Karen Selick.
Got the height right, but the distance. Okay, this is actually the my fifth one of these seminars. I guess there's been 7, but I missed a couple of them. But I see a lot of people that I recognize, and a couple of people that I only know from Facebook, and some people that I've never met before. So if you're one of the people that I've never met before, I probably I look forward to meeting you, and you guys are really in for something great, because it's always been a fun weekend, which is why I keep coming back. And I'd like to thank Peter for putting me on first, because that means I get to get this over with and enjoy the rest of the weekend. But there's a downside to it too, because once you go first, everyone always wants to debate with you for the whole rest of the weekend. I heard what you had to say. So, but actually, that has its own silver lining too, because just the other day I got an email from Brian Lee Crowley, who's the head of Civitas right now, and he asked me if I would organize a panel on the subject of the human rights laws for the next Civitas meeting, which will be in Winnipeg, in May. And so he asked me to see if I could find people on both sides of the issue. So if anyone here really does debate me afterwards and puts up a good argument, I don't see how you'll be able to. But if you do, then I'm recruiting for the Civitas debate. Okay, so the title of my talk today is Canada's Human Rights Laws, UGH, which could have been yuck, but just whatever word you prefer. And the laws that I'm talking about, I just want to clarify, I'm not sure that everyone is on the same page as I am, but there's a federal law called the Canadian Human Rights Act, and then every province, and probably every territory, I'm not sure, but certainly every province has its own version. In Ontario, it's called the Ontario Human Rights Code. Alberta has a strange name, but most of them are called something like that. And so every province and the federal government all have these statutes that are designed to be anti-discrimination laws. So it's kind of strange that when we talk about China and its human rights violations, we're talking about people being killed, In Canada, when we're talking about human rights violations, we're talking about people being discriminated against. But that's what the laws that I'm talking about are, that's what they do. They specify certain categories of people, landlords, employers, people who provide goods and services, and say that those people can't discriminate when they hire or when they sell or when they rent to people on the basis of race, religion, sex, color, place of origin, and all that sort of stuff. And most of those laws also set up some kind of commission, some kind of bureaucracy, so that if there is an allegation that somebody has violated your human rights, you go before the commission and go before a tribunal and have your case heard. And they also provide for penalties for people who violate rights and so on. So my position on this is that all of this is invalid. They should all be repealed, and I've been writing this for many, many years. I dug up some articles going back to 1995 saying that human rights codes should be repealed. Now, most people think that that's a very extreme position, and that there could be some good come out of these human rights laws. But one of the things I propose to demonstrate today is that there isn't. They're bad from their inception. They're not just being abused. They're not just going too far. They're fundamentally bad, and so that's why they should be repealed. Just as an example of the sort of moderate position that people are always trying to take, some of you may have heard recently on the news, probably about 3 weeks ago, there was this big battle going on in a parliamentary committee where the Conservative Party has taken the position that the Indian Act needs to be amended because the Indians were left out of the Canadian Human Rights Act many, many years ago. And they want to repeal that section of the Indian Act so that the Indians will be brought back within the Canadian Human Rights Act. And there's a big squabble over this. Well, in my view, the Conservative Party needs to rethink the Canadian Human Rights Act. Instead of trying to drag the Indians in, they should be letting all the rest of us out. And I've actually got an article that will be published in the Globe and Mail on that, hopefully next week. But one distinction, before I go on here, one distinction that I want to make is I'm not including in this one provision of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is also an anti-discrimination law, and I want to draw the distinction there. There's subsection 15.1 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms says, every individual is equal before and under the law and has the right to the equal protection and benefit of the law without discrimination, and in particular, without discrimination based on race, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, sex, age, or mental or physical disability. And I actually support that law as a provision in our Constitution. I think that that is a good thing to have in a Constitution, good thing to have as a general principle of law. Now, strangely enough, the good effects of subsection 15.1 of the Charter are undone by the next subsection that follows it, which says exactly the opposite. It says, subsection 1 does not preclude any law, program, or activity that has as its object the amelioration of conditions of disadvantaged individuals or groups, including those that are disadvantaged because of race, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, sex, age, or mental or physical disability. So in other words, the state can discriminate in favor of people and undo all of the anti-discrimination laws in the previous subsection of the Charter, but anyhow. The reason that this law, the part that I like, 15.1, is acceptable, whereas the Canadian Human Rights Code and all the provincial human rights codes are not acceptable, is that it governs what the state can do to its citizens. And because we are all involuntarily subjected to laws by the state by virtue of being here on the territory, because the federal government has, and all of the governments have, monopolies on what they can do to people. They have a legal monopoly on the use of force within their territory. I think that it is incumbent upon them to treat everybody equally, and that is to have laws of equal application without discrimination on the basis of irrelevant personal characteristics. That's different from the human rights codes, which don't govern the relationship between the state and individual, but govern the relationship between one individual and another, or between a business and an individual. So I want to make sure that you understand the distinction there. I think it's very important that the state be prevented from discriminating on the basis of irrelevancies. That is, when the state makes laws, it has to make laws of general application that apply without discriminating on the basis of those personal characteristics. but that's not the same thing as how people should have to deal with each other. So, for instance, if we don't like some law that the state has enacted, we don't have any choice. We're subject to it in any event. Whereas if we don't like something that an employer, a private employer, has done, there's lots of choices. We can go find another employer. If we don't like something that a landlord has done, we can find another landlord. So I don't mean that when I say that I like the 15 sub 1 of the Charter, I don't mean to say that it should apply in the same way as a human rights code as far as employment and so on. I don't think that the federal government should, for instance, have to hire a proportion of employees that all fall into these different categories of minority groups that we have in the country. What I do mean is that the laws should be of equal application and indifferent between people as far as their race, religion, color, and so on. Okay, so I tried to make a list of 10, but I could only get 9. 9 major things wrong with the human rights laws. That is the ones that I am talking about in this talk. And I've got the list that I'll go through quickly, and then I'll come back and go through each one more specifically. So the first thing wrong is that even though the laws talk about human rights, what they are really dealing with are not rights, and I'll get to a definition of rights later on. What the human rights codes do is actually grant privileges, and to that extent they actually violate the spirit of subsection 15.1 of the Charter, because the laws in effect grant privileges to some people on the basis of race, religion, and so on that aren't available to others. Okay, the second thing that's wrong is that the human rights codes violate one right that is a genuine right, which is the right to freedom of contract. Number 3, the human rights codes violate another real right, which is the right to private property and the use of private property. Number 4, they violate a third real right, which is a real right, which is freedom of speech. Number 5, the human rights codes are actually a disguised form of socialism. Number 6, they backfire frequently by making the people who are supposed to be protected by them actually worse off in many respects. Number 7, they make the world a worse place for everyone, not just the people that they're supposed to protect, but everyone else, to the extent that they sometimes result in promoting mediocrity over excellence. Number 8, they foster hostility among different groups in society. And number 9, they create a lot of confusion in people's minds. All this rights talk about things that aren't really rights it makes people think that all kinds of things are rights, and makes people think that freedom from discrimination is somehow the be-all and end-all of the law. And it creates a lot of confusion in the minds of people about what is and isn't proper law. Okay, so I'm going to go through that list slowly now and talk about the details. So number 1 was that the human rights codes don't really grant real rights, or they don't really have anything to do with real rights. What they actually do is they grant privileges. And in order to determine this, you have to understand what a right really is. So the most fundamental characteristic of something that we call a right is that it has to be universal. If it's not universal, if it's granted to certain people and not others, then it's not properly called a right, it's a privilege or a preference. So this narrows the field of rights considerably, because one of the corollaries inherent in the concept of a right is that if you have a right, it imposes on everyone else an obligation. Every right that you claim means that everyone else in the world has some obligation in order to ensure that you have your right respected. So the only kinds of things that actually fall into this category of proper rights are the things that philosophers generally refer to as negative rights. For instance, if you talk about the right to life, you can interpret it from the negative rights tradition as meaning that the obligation imposed on everyone else is to refrain from killing you. That is, not to deny your right to life. All they have to do is don't kill you, and they've respected your right to life. But if you interpret the right to life as a positive right, then you can say, well, my right to life gives me the right to food, shelter, clothing, medical care, all that sort of stuff. Then different consequences follow. And one of those consequences would be if you have the right to all of those things, somebody else has the obligation to provide them for you. But since all of that stuff, shelter and clothing and food, doesn't fall like manna from heaven, somebody has to produce it, and that means that somebody has the obligation to produce this stuff and give it to you. So if you have a right to life that includes all of those things, somebody else's right to life essentially is being violated because a portion of their life is being taken away to produce that stuff and taken away from them and given to you. So whenever there's a positive right, it involves that kind of contradiction. That is, if somebody has a right to something positive, that means that somebody else has the obligation to provide it. And the world is divided into the people who are the givers and the people who are the takers. Which means that that is a good test for whether something is or isn't a right. Because if it's that kind of right, it's obviously not universal and doesn't meet the test of being a right. And there's two other characteristics of genuine rights that I want to point out because I think they're also fundamental and you can sort of use them as a test about whether something is a genuine right. So a genuine right, in order to be implemented, really requires nothing more than an act of will on the part of other human beings. So the right to life, from the negative point of view, just requires that other people not kill you. All they have to do is refrain from killing you. They don't have to do anything positive, they just have to refrain from killing you, and then you've got a right to life. But similarly with the right to liberty. If we all agree that we won't kidnap one another or imprison one another, then everyone's right to liberty has been respected. But no amount of sheer willpower or sheer good intentions is ever going to fulfill a positive right to life if that includes something like the right to food. Okay, the other sort of test or fundamental characteristic of a genuine right is that it is independent of time, place, and natural disaster. So the right of a person not to be killed by his fellow citizens can be fulfilled equally in every era, in every corner of the globe. But it has only been within the past century, and certainly only in some countries, that the wealth has existed to even contemplate a guarantee of universal food. There have been places in the world, even today, but particularly the past, where people have starved to death or died in droughts. And certainly you can't say that their rights were violated. That would be a bizarre interpretation of rights. So the so-called rights under the Human Rights Code is really just a, quote, right, and I'll have to sort of indicate that in quotes a lot of the time through this talk, to freedom from discrimination. And at first it sounds as though, well, maybe that's a negative right too, because we can all just refrain from discriminating against one another. All it takes is an act of will. I don't have to actually do anything, but that's not really what they're getting at when they talk about freedom from discrimination. And when you look at the type of claims that are made under this kind of law, the cases that have gone before the tribunals, what people are really looking for when they invoke the right to freedom from discrimination is that they're trying to force you to give them something. And in some cases they're trying to force you to give them a job, or they're trying to force you to rent an apartment to them, or they're trying to force you to provide goods or services to them when your preference would be not to do that. So freedom from discrimination is really a positive right and not a negative right, and as such, I would say it's not really a right at all. Okay. The second criticism that I made was that the right to freedom from discrimination violates another right, which is a true negative right, and that is the right to freedom of contract. Freedom of contract, you can sort of go through the test. It's a true negative right. All we have to do to ensure that everybody has it is refrain from interfering in other people's contracts. You refrain from interfering in mine, I'll refrain from interfering in yours. Everybody has freedom of contract. And it's been possible in all places and all times until now, when the Human Rights Code has come along. And one of the famous examples that probably many of you have heard of is the case a couple of years ago of a guy named Scott Brocky, who was a printer somewhere here in Ontario. Maybe he wasn't in Ontario. I forget what province he was in. But anyhow, he was a Christian, and he was in the printing business. He prints letterheads and envelopes and stuff like that. And he was approached by a gay organization who wanted him to do their printing. They wanted him to print up letterhead, envelopes, stationery of all kinds. And he said, I don't think I'd like to do that because I'm really opposed to the gay lifestyle, and if I did that, I would feel that I was supporting your cause. So thanks very much for your business, but no thank you. So they took him to the Human Rights Commission, and eventually he was fined something like $2,000, and that was the outcome of his case. Now, obviously, one of the essences of freedom of contract is that you should be able to choose with whom you contract. That's always been one of the fundamental aspects of freedom of contract, is the identity of the person with whom you contract. So clearly the Human Rights Code violated Scott Brockey's right to freedom of contract. The interesting thing is, this guy didn't have any obligation to the world to publish anything or to print anything for anybody. If he had wanted to, he could have closed down his shop and not printed anything for anybody. He said, I'm out of business, I don't print anything for anybody, and nobody could have objected. He had no fundamental obligation to print things for people. But the Human Rights Commission came along and said, you have an obligation to print something for these guys. So, you know, it's involuntary servitude. It's a form of slavery. Okay, the next thing that the human rights codes do is they violate another thing, which is a proper negative right, which is the right to the use of private property. And again, this is a proper negative right. If I don't interfere with your use of property, you don't interfere with mine. Everybody's property rights are protected. All it takes is an act of will. It can be respected in any era, any place, and regardless of whether there has been any natural disaster. So that's a genuine negative right. But here's some cases that have been decided under the Human Rights Code. There was one in Ontario a number of years ago, Bramalea and Kearney. It was a landlord and tenant case where the Bramalea company had a policy of saying, we won't rent apartments unless you pass a certain financial test. And the financial test is that the rent can't be more than some fixed percentage of your income. And I don't remember what percentage it was, maybe it's 30%, but if the tenant didn't meet that test, they wouldn't rent to that tenant. So three individuals decided that they didn't like that, and they wanted to object under the Human Rights Code. Now, it sounds like a pretty objective test to me, right? They didn't say, we won't rent to people of this color, or this race, or this religion. They just said, if you can't pay, if your rent's more than 30% of your income, we won't rent to you. But the Human Rights Commission found that this was a form of discrimination on a prohibited ground. And in particular, they said, this is a form of discrimination against women, the elderly, and low-income earners. Now that's kind of interesting for Ontario because low-income earners aren't even a protected group under the Ontario legislation, but they made a finding that this was discrimination against them. There are some provinces where low-income earners, or at least people on welfare, are a protected group. You can't discriminate against people on public assistance, but Ontario isn't one of them. But that was the outcome of that case. So those landlords were thereafter compelled to rent to people that they didn't choose to rent to, or, they were in fact had to part with possession of their private property. It was a violation of their property rights. The interesting thing about this too is that if you sort of extrapolate what else a landlord does that might be, that might fall within this category of violating the rights of low-income earners, almost everything that a landlord does would. I mean, if you ask for first month's and last month's rent, there are going to be some people who can't afford it. So again, you've discriminated against presumably women, the elderly, and low-income earners. Almost anything that a landlord does, you ask anybody to pay the rent. If it's a certain amount and some people can't afford it, then they've had their rights violated. So you could extrapolate this out and basically say that the only thing that a landlord could validly do is give away apartments for free to anybody who comes and applies in order to actually meet the provisions of the Human Rights Code. There's another example of private property rights violations that's one of my favorites. It's horrifying, but it's really such a good example that I like to tell people about it. There was a chiropractor in London, Ontario, a number of years ago, who was approached by, I guess he was probably telephoned by a lady who was disabled, and she used a wheelchair. And she made an appointment to go see the chiropractor. Now, my guess is that she probably knew exactly what she was in for before she started this, because I've checked this lady out, and I think she's one of these disabled activists. But anyhow, she arrived at the chiropractor's office and found that she couldn't get into his office because the first thing you had to do when you got to the door there was go up a flight of stairs, and she was in a wheelchair. So the chiropractor said to her, I've got a couple of other alternatives for you. Another one of the chiropractors and I will come downstairs and carry you up to the second floor office where you can have your chiropractic treatment. Or I will come to your home and treat you there, or I have a friend who's a chiropractor and he has wheelchair accessible space and I will meet you there and treat you in his office. Take your pick. But the lady said, those choices violate my dignity, and I would like to object to this, and I think that you have to build a ramp and put in an elevator in order to accommodate me. And she took her case to the Human Rights Commission in Ontario, and they said, yes, ma'am, absolutely, you're right, your dignity is violated. He didn't try to accommodate you sufficiently, and they made the guy install wheelchair access to his chiropractic office, which meant he lost one parking space in his lot, and he lost the use of one examination room in order to put in the elevator or whatever. And it cost him something like $20,000 to do the renovations, which actually that was many years ago, so it would probably cost more in today's dollars. And the interesting thing is, I don't know whether that lady ever went back to him for chiropractic treatment or not. I mean, that part of the case, I tried to contact the chiropractor after this case was reported, and I think he just didn't want to talk to anybody. So I never did find out whether she went back, but my guess is that she didn't. I mean, like, who wants to wait around for 5 years while your case goes through the Human Rights Commission, and then the guy installs all these changes to his office so that you can get chiropractic treatment? If she really did need it, she probably had it years before the case was finished. So there you go. There's a really nice violation of property rights, thanks to our Human Rights Code. Okay, item number 4 was that the Human Rights Code also violates another genuine freedom, which is the freedom of speech. And this is becoming more and more apparent. Anybody who does any writing at all these days is probably finding you can hardly say anything anymore without worrying that someone is going to claim that you've violated their rights under the Human Rights Act. But almost all of the human rights codes say something like, if you're an employer, you can't advertise in such a way as to indicate that you might be discriminating on the grounds of race, color, and all that sort of stuff. But some of them actually have much more explicit provisions that violate freedom of speech. And the Saskatchewan Human Rights Code really takes the prize for this. It actually starts out with a little mini Bill of Rights right at the beginning, and one of the things that it guarantees is the right to freedom of expression through all means of communication, including speech, the press, and so on. I think that's in Section 5. And then in Section 14, just 9 sections later, it contradicts itself. Now, I've taken out some of the excess verbiage, but here's what the Human Rights Code says in Saskatchewan. No person shall publish any statement which exposes or tends to expose to hatred, ridicules, belittles, or otherwise affronts the dignity of any person, any class of persons, or a group of persons, because of his or their religion, creed, marital status, family status, sex, sexual orientation, disability, age, color, ancestry, nationality, place of origin, race, perceived race, or receipt of public assistance. So I think they've included just about everything. But the very next subsection is really neat, because it says, nothing in the preceding subsection restricts the right to freedom of speech under the law upon any subject. Excuse me. If the preceding subsection doesn't restrict the freedom of speech, what on earth is it there for? Of course, it's there to restrict freedom of speech. And if the legislators were uneasy about what they were doing, they should have considered leaving it out. Instead of putting it in, we're restricting freedom of speech, and adding a bold-faced lie saying we're not restricting freedom of speech. Now, in June of 2000, there was a federally appointed panel that was going to review the federal version of this, the Canadian Human Rights Act, and they were going to try to update it. And the report that they issued demonstrates just how far some people, some prominent Canadians, are willing to go to quash freedom of expression. Some of the examples that they cited in their report of statements that supposedly demonstrate, they were talking in the Canadian Human Rights Act of also putting in this, you can't discriminate against people on the grounds of poverty. That's one of the things they wanted to add. The Act, I don't think, ever did say that, but they wanted to put that in. And they quoted as examples of some things that they found offensive this. If we want children to get a good and healthy start in life, what we need more than anything else is responsible parents. That was economics professor Chris Sarlo, published in the Fraser Institute. Or another quote, this one's from an editorial in the Globe and Mail. They said, "That's why health and education policymakers should help Canada's most needy children, often the poorest ones, by helping their mothers and fathers learn how to be better parents." Well, these were things that were quoted as examples of such horrible discrimination against the poor that we had to outlaw these statements and make them contrary to the Human Rights Code. So, you know, if they ever succeeded, would there be anything that could safely be said on the subject of poverty without offending somebody? Yeah, they also said that they weren't going to attempt to define hate because the section that would outlaw hate messages might lose some of its reach. Well, yes, it might not catch the Fraser Institute, it might not catch the Globe and Mail. And they also said, the panel also said, a truthful statement in this context is just as damaging as an untruthful one. So the truth of what you say has nothing to do with it for these people. Okay, there are several real-life examples of people that have been prosecuted under these speech laws. Some of you may recall the case of Doug Collins, the writer out in BC, wrote an op-ed about the movie Schindler's List. He called it Swindler's List, and it apparently offended some Jewish man out there who objected, and Mr. Collins was fined $2,000. And of course, the Western Standard magazine that I write for, that probably a lot of you read, is currently facing a human rights complaint brought by some Muslim person who thought that when the Western Standard reprinted the Mohammed cartoons that somehow they were violating his rights. So Ezra Levant faces the possibility of being disbarred as a lawyer if he's found to have violated his right, and if he refuses to do what they tell him to do in order to make good, or he could go to jail. Okay, so clearly one bad thing about the Human Rights Codes. Okay, number 5 on my list. The Human Rights Codes are really just a disguised form of socialism. Now that may sound like a funny thing to say, but it's kind of interesting because what the Human Rights Codes do is they divide the population into two classes of people who are given completely different treatment. And the first group of people can be broadly described as consumers. And consumers can't be discriminated against on the grounds of race, sex, handicap, and all that sort of stuff. They can't be discriminated against by people in the other class. And if they think they have been discriminated against, they can complain to the Human Rights Commission. The second group of people can be broadly described as business people, and they're the ones who provide the services and the goods and the facilities and the accommodations in exchange for money. Now, the first group can freely discriminate against the second group on every imaginable ground, because there's nothing in the Human Rights Code that forbids discrimination in the provision of money. You can't discriminate in the provision of goods and services, but you can discriminate in providing money. So if a person in a wheelchair chooses to eat at an English-style pub instead of the French restaurant or the Chinese restaurant in the same block, the restaurant owners that have been snubbed can't go bleating to the Human Rights Commission about her cruel ethnic discrimination. Nor can any of the ethnic restaurant owners claim systemic discrimination if his restaurant fails while those of his neighbors succeed. And the Human Rights Commission won't force the locals in the neighborhood to eat their fair share of Chinese food. Businesses simply have to live with the fact that in a market economy, consumers are free to deal with whomever they choose. Now here's another example. Clients occasionally tell me that they picked my name out of the Yellow Pages as a lawyer because they wanted a female lawyer. And presumably there are other people who choose not to hire me for the same reason, because they don't want a female lawyer. Now the Law Society in Ontario a couple of years ago actually endorsed this practice by allowing the lawyer referral service to fill gender-specific requests. So if somebody calls up the lawyer referral service in Ontario and says, "I want a woman," they will be referred to a woman. And a Law Society committee was even asked to consider permitting clients to request a referral by race or ethnic origin. However, the rules of professional conduct that govern me as a lawyer make it clear that I can't screen out my clients on the basis of sex, race, or ethnic origin. Well, why should there be this dichotomy? I mean, every commercial transaction consists of two parties making an exchange. Goods and services and facilities or accommodation flow in one direction, and money flows in the other direction. Both parties to the transaction must feel that what they're getting is more valuable than what they're giving up, otherwise they wouldn't engage in the deal. So why should one group be free to select the identity of the person they wish to profit from, while the other group isn't? Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not advocating that the human rights code should apply in both directions. Of course, I'm suggesting that it should be scrapped so that freedom of contract can prevail for all. But the only way to make sense of this dichotomy is to realize that the code isn't really about protecting minorities against racism or sexism or other isms. It's really about subjugating certain classes of people who are presumed to be powerful to the classes of people who are presumed to be powerless. And so business people and landlords of all races and all sexes, and whether they're disabled or not, they're the targets. And consumers and tenants are the beneficiaries, because business people are presumed to be powerful and have money, and consumers and tenants are presumed to be powerless and not have money. Now, of course, these presumptions aren't particularly accurate. There are many consumers and many tenants who are wealthier and more influential than the business people and the landlords that they deal with. But this doesn't seem to bother the people at the Human Rights Commission. And what the Human Rights Codes do is it imposes a form of involuntary servitude on certain members of society, that is, the goods and service providers. And it transforms others, the consumers, who belong to one of the privileged groups, into their masters. And the business people, in effect, are forced to perform services for the other people against their will. There was a time when we called this slavery, but we don't call it that anymore. But this is just another way in which the left, along with environmentalism, is trying to sort of slip socialism into the mainstream without explicitly taking money from one group and giving it to another group. They sort of try to slip it through the back door here by taking power from people they deem powerless and giving it and letting them use it against the people they consider powerful. Okay, number 6. The Human Rights Codes backfire, making minorities worse off frequently than they would otherwise have been. Now, I've been an employer for 22 years, and when I hire people, there are certain things that I want to know about them. And in my law firm, we've had a revolving door many times. We've had people come and go and come and go and come and go. And one of the things that I would like to know in particular when I hire lawyers is whether they're going to stay. And one of the factors that seems to determine whether or not people are likely to stay is, do they have a spouse who's likely to stay? Or in case of women, are they planning to get pregnant and go off on either temporary maternity leave or forever? So I would really like to know when I hire junior lawyers what their intentions are, but I'm not allowed to ask because that's considered to be discrimination on the basis of sex. So the Law Society a couple of years ago sent around very detailed lists of things because they surveyed all the articling students and young lawyers and said, what is it that you're being asked that you think violates the human rights codes? And they got long lists of these things, and they sent these around to lawyers saying, you can't ask this, you can't ask this, you can't ask this. But the easiest thing to do, if I want to make sure that a lawyer that I'm going to hire is not going to get pregnant and go off on maternity leave, the easiest thing to do is not hire women lawyers. So in one way, by putting all these restrictions on me, they're sort of forcing me to take one step back and discriminate at an earlier stage than I would otherwise do. If I could find out whether the women lawyers I was interviewing are planning to move away because their husbands are going to get posted in the military or something like that, because we are in a military area, or if they're going to get pregnant and take a whole lot of time off, I would at least be able to sort out between the people who qualify, who meet my criteria, namely, if I hire you, you're going to stay, and people who are going to leave. So, to some extent, the women who would join my firm and stay are being sort of mentally screened out even at an earlier stage before they even get a chance to tell me what their intentions are. I'm not allowed to ask. So those people are certainly being harmed by these laws that prevent me from even asking this. The same thing happens when landlords are forced to comply with laws like this. Every once in a while you'll read these exposés that are done in newspapers where the Toronto Star loves doing this sort of thing, where they have people call around to advertisements for apartments for rent and use different accents, and the person with an accent will be told that the apartment's already rented, while the person without an accent is told that the apartment's still available. You know, if not for the human rights codes, I'm pretty sure that landlords would be a lot more flexible about who they rented to, because they would then be able to get rid of an undesirable tenant without having a claim brought against them before the Human Rights Commission. Okay, point number 7. The human rights laws actually make the world a worse place in general, to the extent that they result in the hiring of mediocrity in place of excellence. And this is pretty easy to understand. If we are reserving spots in medical schools and dental schools and so on to ensure that minorities have positions there, and the people who are filling those positions are less qualified than the people who are being turned away, then overall our complement of doctors and dentists is going to be less qualified than they otherwise would. If we're not hiring the best qualified firefighters because we have to say that a certain percentage of firefighters have to be women, or a certain percent of firefighters have to be minorities who are smaller and weaker, then we're going to lose more buildings and more property damage and lose more lives in fires. So pretty clear that from that point of view, the human rights laws make the world a worse place for everyone. Point number 8, they foster hostility between groups. This point sort of follows on from the last one. If you are somebody who got passed over for a job because you are white, male, Anglo-Saxon, and there was a certain percentage of the jobs that were being reserved for people other than you, you're going to resent it. And if people feel that the world is, you know, we have less qualified doctors, less qualified firefighters for these reasons, they're going to resent that too. In particularly lately, there's been a lot of sort of rights conflicts arising from these phony rights between gay groups and Christians. And last year there was that case of the gay high school student who wanted to take his date to the prom at the Catholic school. And then there's a case of the Knights of Columbus out in BC who were they had mistakenly rented a hall to some lesbians for a same-sex wedding, and then, you know, when everybody found out, oh my God, this is a Catholic group and we're being forced to rent our hall to this same-sex couple. So there's a lot of hostility being fostered by these laws. And finally, point number 9, the reason this is bad, is that all this rights talk makes people very confused about what really is a right and what really isn't a right. And people come forward and say that they have all kinds of rights. Just the other day in the Globe and Mail, yesterday in fact, you know that this Montebello conference coming up, Stephen Harper's going to be meeting with George Bush and the President of Mexico at Montebello, and there's some protest group that isn't very happy about the fact that they're being kept out of the hotel and they're being told to stay in a certain area and protest there. And they're saying, well, they have a right to be heard. They have a right to be heard, and that right also involves being on a hotel property. Well, no, it doesn't. The right to freedom of speech is clearly a negative right. You have the right to say other people can't prevent you from saying certain things, but they don't have to allow you to say it in certain places. My friend Walter Block, an economics professor, always says, you know, your right to freedom of speech doesn't give you the right to come and recite Shakespearean sonnets in my bedroom at 2 o'clock in the morning. You know, property rights are paramount over the right that this guy says he has to be heard as a protester. Another example in the National Post just the day before, on Thursday, some woman who was an adoptive mother was ticked off because she only got 35 weeks of employment insurance benefits as an adoptive mother, whereas biological mothers get 50 weeks of employment insurance. And so she's gone off to the Supreme Court of Canada thinking that her rights were violated and she's been discriminated against. Apparently she's not capable of understanding that there is a difference between people who actually physically give birth and have to take time off to recover for that. I don't support EI in any event, but you know, this kind of confusion where, like, you know, my rights have been violated. Like, why am I not being treated the same as a birth parent just because I'm an adoptive parent? There's a whole, you know, this whole idea of all these things being rights is creating confusion among people. Okay. Now, if we actually did repeal the human rights laws, what would happen to members of minority groups? Well, this is a pretty thorny question. Because that's why we have the laws in the first place. Everybody says, well, if we didn't have these things, people would mistreat members of minorities. Well, I just want to point out that members of minorities are protected against the worst kinds of discrimination by the criminal code, just like everyone else. They're protected against violence. They're protected against theft. You know, they're protected against having their property violated. But I guess the question always is, would they starve? Would they not be able to get jobs if we didn't have the Human Rights Code giving them the right to be free from discrimination? So the example that I would like to use now is the example of the Ferengi. Does everybody know who the Ferengi are? The Ferengi from Star Trek The Next Generation and Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Okay, the Ferengi were that group that had these weird eyebrow ridges that, you know, sort of came around and made ears out of themselves. And they had these funny ribbed noses and very spiky teeth. They were incredibly ugly. And on the show they were called free traders. Well, that's a terrible insult to anybody who really is a free trader. But, the Ferengi, you know, people really got into this this science fiction thing, and somebody has written the Ferengi Code of Conduct. And there are 285 maxims to guide the daily lives of Ferengis, and I'm just going to read you a couple of them that I picked out here. Okay, a deal is a deal until a better one comes along. There is nothing more dangerous than an honest businessman. Never ask when you can take. Anything worth selling is worth selling twice. A contract is a contract is a contract, but only between Ferengi. Never cheat a Klingon unless you can get away with it. Let others keep their reputation, you keep their money. Never be afraid to mislabel a product. And when in doubt, lie. Okay, so that's part of the Ferengi Code of Conduct. Now, if Ferengis were real, and they came down to Earth here and applied to you for a job, would you hire a Ferengi? Well, I sure as hell wouldn't, because it would wreck my business. It would offend my customers. You know, the Ferengi would probably cheat me too. So I would not want to hire a Ferengi. But I wouldn't be able to tell them why. I wouldn't be able to say, you know, I won't hire you Ferengis because you're a bunch of lying, cheating scumbags. I couldn't say that, because that would violate the human rights laws. Even though they're aliens, I guess you know, you can't discriminate against them on the basis of place of origin. Now, without the Human Rights Code, you could refuse to hire a Ferengi, and you could tell them, it's because you people lie and cheat. It's part of your code of conduct. Change your code of conduct, and maybe you'll be able to get a job. So, what would the results be if we didn't have the Human Rights Code? Well, possibly fewer Ferengi would come to Earth because they would say, I'm not protected by the Human Rights Code, therefore I won't come. I won't try to look for a job there because I won't get one. Or possibly the Ferengi would come anyhow and they would change their ways and they would start to realize that what they needed to do in order to get jobs was change their code and strive to be honest and deal fairly with people. Now, the one interesting thing I just point out here is that I'm forced to resort to these fictitious characters of Ferengis to make this point because, heaven forbid I should suggest that there are actual cultural differences between real people on Earth that might persuade an employer that they might want to hire one person from one group and not a person from another group. I can't say that. I'm not allowed to say that by the Human Rights Code, so I'll have to resort to Ferengis. But anyhow, what was the actual experience of people in Canada before the Human Rights Code? So we haven't always had these things. In Ontario, we didn't get the Human Rights Code until 1961. Okay, my grandparents came to Canada between 1900 and 1910, all four of them, and we're Jewish. I mean, I'm an atheist, but my grandparents were Jewish. So what did they do to overcome discrimination? Because there was plenty of discrimination back then. My grandfather told me a story about how he used to work on a farm, and he assumed a false name, used a false surname so that they wouldn't realize he was Jewish, and he went to church with the farm family on Sunday. He didn't want people to realize. He tried to assimilate. I'm told that there was such discrimination back in those days that Jewish merchants who owned stores couldn't even get fire insurance if they had a back door, because the thought was that Jews are dishonest, and what they'll do is they'll stage a fire, and meanwhile they'll move the merchandise out the back door. They couldn't get fire insurance. So what did people do about this before the Human Rights Code? Well, they tried to assimilate. As I said, they changed their names. I actually grew up on a street where about 25% of the people were Jewish, and the other 75% weren't. And one of the kids in my circle of friends was a kid named Gordon Lindsay, and he'd swear he was Scottish, right? No, he was actually an Orthodox Jew. They changed their name for something, I don't know what. But I can specifically remember, because I was born before the Human Rights Code, I can specifically remember being taught by my parents not to do certain things that people associated with the negative characteristics of Jews. Don't Jew people down. I wasn't told that in so many words, but I was told, don't bargain with people. If you don't like the price, don't buy it. Don't bargain with people. And to this day, I'm uncomfortable bargaining with people. When my husband and I go shopping, he loves to. He's not Jewish at all. He loves to bargain with people, but I don't do it. I feel uncomfortable. I was taught not to be pushy. Wait your turn. Don't butt into line. These are things that my parents said. And also, there's a certain inflection that Jewish people sometimes use when they speak. I was taught, say it, don't sing it. Don't, just speak in a normal tone of voice. Don't sound like a Jew. A lot of people don't realize that I'm Jewish, and in particular a lot of clients I find in my law practice don't realize. I once had this one Jewish woman accuse me of being anti-Semitic. And I once had another client tell me that the Jews are taking over Picton, which I found really, really strange. I'll never forget it. I think I'm the only one that I know down there. But anyway. So I guess what I'm advocating is, I'm advocating assimilation. It's not for everybody. If you don't like the idea of assimilating, you're a member of a minority group and don't like the idea of assimilating, that's fine. Don't assimilate. But you have to realize that there is, there are pros and cons, and there are prices to be paid. And if what you really want to do is be part of the mainstream economy and not cause anybody to think differently about you, then you assimilate. If you are not willing to do that and want to retain your culture and want to, be different, then go ahead and do that. But just realize that there will be some people who will, as a result, not want to deal with you. But when you make that decision of whether to assimilate or not assimilate, you're doing it so that you do it at your own expense. That is, if you choose not to assimilate and adopt the mainstream culture, you do it at your own expense, rather than the expense of everyone else who, with the Human Rights Commission system, is forced to deal with you at their expense. Okay, but what if the discrimination against Ferengi isn't just based on their horrible creed or their horrible culture, but it's based on something that they can't do anything about, something they can't change, like their really ugly appearance? What do you do then? Do you need a human rights code to deal with those things that aren't merely cultural? I would again say no, and I say this because I think that the marketplace is the best system that we have of reducing the effects of discrimination. In employment, for instance, employers want to hire the best people available, and if the best people available happen to be people who are members of a minority group, there's going to be a strong incentive to overcome your prejudices and hire the people who are members of a minority group. Because if you don't, your competitors are going to. And your competitors are going to get ahead of you. And so purely from an economic point of view, in the case of employment, if there are good people out there who happen to be members of a minority group that you think are ugly or you just don't like for whatever reason, and you still have an economic incentive to hire them. Because if you don't, and your employer doesn't share your your competitors don't share your prejudices, your competitors are going to be hiring those people, they're going to get better people than you are, and they're going to be beating the pants off you in business. The same thing with the provisions of goods, services, and accommodations. Like, why would anybody voluntarily limit his market by discriminating in the provision of goods and services just because he doesn't like the race or color of the buyer? Historically, in fact, you can see that, I tried to find this article. I know that I've read an article at one stage that had some empirical evidence about discrimination in government entities versus discrimination in the private sector prior to the Human Rights Codes. And there was some evidence that in government there was a lot of discrimination because those people didn't have any profit incentive to not discriminate. They could indulge their prejudices, no skin off their nose, because no one ever knows whether the government's doing a good job or a bad job, and there's no consequences to whether it does a good job or a bad job. Whereas to the private sector, if they're doing a bad job, and if some of it is caused by the fact that they're refusing to hire the best people, then there's an obvious financial incentive for them to change their ways. But just going back to this business of why would you want to limit your markets? There's an essay by Thomas Sowell that he wrote. Anyone know who Thomas Sowell is? Economist, black, American. He wrote an essay called Rosa Parks and History. Rosa Parks is the black woman, the one who finally said, I refuse to sit at the back of the bus, supposedly the start of the big human rights movement in the U.S. Sowell said, okay, I'm going to read an excerpt from his essay here. Far from existing from time immemorial, as many have assumed, racially segregated seating in public transportation began in the South in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Those who see government as a solution to social problems may be surprised to learn that it was government which created this problem. Many, if not most, municipal transit systems were privately owned in the 19th century, and the private owners of these systems had no incentive to segregate the races. These owners may have been racist themselves, but they were in business to make a profit, and you don't make a profit by alienating a lot of your customers. There was not enough market demand for Jim Crow seating on municipal transit to bring it about. It was politics that segregated the races, because the incentives of the political process are different from the incentives of the economic process. Both blacks and whites spent money to ride the buses, but after the disenfranchisement of black voters in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, only whites counted in the political process. It was not necessary for an overwhelming majority of the white voters to demand racial segregation. If some did and the others didn't care, that was sufficient politically because what blacks wanted didn't count politically after they had lost the vote. The incentives of the economic system and the incentives of the political system were not only different, they clashed. Private owners of the streetcar, bus, and railroad companies in the South lobbied against the Jim Crow laws while these laws were being written, challenged them in the courts after the laws were passed, and then dragged their feet in enforcing those laws after they were upheld by the courts. These tactics delayed the enforcement of Jim Crow seating laws for years in some places. Then, company employees began to be arrested for not enforcing such laws, and at least one president of a streetcar company was threatened with jail if he didn't comply. None of this resistance was based on a desire for civil rights for blacks. It was based on a fear of losing money if racial segregation caused black customers to use public transportation less often than they would have in the absence of this affront. But I'm also confident that we wouldn't have discrimination of this nature to any great degree in Canada, primarily because whenever I talk about abolishing the human rights codes, there are so many people who get into a complete panic and say, well, but people would be discriminated against, and they obviously think that that type of discrimination is evil and wrong and immoral and improper, that I'm confident that they wouldn't do it anyhow. The overwhelming majority of Canadians think that it's wrong to discriminate just because somebody is of a different color or race. And I'm confident that they wouldn't do it. So the final question that you have to come to is, so what if the discrimination isn't caused by culture or creed, and it isn't caused by mere physical differences like ugliness or some observable difference in race, but what if it really is caused by true inferiority? What if there were some group, Klingons for instance, that came to Earth and they were really just stupider than everybody else here and more violent and less desirable as employees, less desirable as tenants, less desirable as customers in every conceivable way? Would they starve in the streets? Well, once again, economics comes to the rescue, because even if there were some group that was completely inferior in every respect, in their productivity, in their intelligence, in their, they said they're prone to violence and so on, there is still something called the theory of comparative advantage. Does everyone know the theory of comparative advantage? Few people. Not everybody? Some people? Okay. Just for the few people that maybe don't. The theory of comparative advantage says that even if there is this group that's inferior in every respect, they won't be inferior in every respect to the same degree in the whole range of activities that human beings engage in. So if you take the two-person example, This is a nice, easy one to understand. The best lawyer in town is also the best typist in town. Should the lawyer do his own typing? Clearly not, because the lawyer, being the best lawyer in town, should spend his time being a lawyer and not doing his typing merely because he's the best typist in town. Even though other people are worse typists than he is, his time is better spent being a lawyer and hiring an inferior typist to do his typing. So the same thing happens with any example that you could come up with. There will always be a difference between people that makes it more practical for people to do one thing that they are comparatively better at doing, even though across the board they're inferior. And let me see if I can give some other example. I'm not sure whether everybody's caught this. Suppose that there's person A and person B, and person A is the superior one and B is the inferior one. And they're making two products, widgets and microphones. And person B, the inferior one, takes one full working day to make a widget and one full working day to make a microphone. Person A, the superior one, can take one full day and make 4 widgets, or one full day and make 3 microphones. Okay, so should person B, the inferior one, just not do anything at all and leave all the production to person A, who is so much more efficient? No, because on the grand scheme of things, they would both lose that way. Person A is relatively more efficient at making widgets. He can make 4 in a day instead of 3 microphones. So person A should make widgets, which he has a comparative advantage in. Person B has the, relatively speaking, comparative advantage in making microphones, because he can make 1 a day of those. Same as he can make with of widgets. Okay, so there will always be something. If you look around, there's always something that people can do, even if they are relatively speaking, or absolutely less skilled on in every front. So I don't think that the Human Rights Code is justified, even if we hypothesize that there is some group that was completely at a disadvantage in every respect. Okay. How am I doing here? My conclusion then. Human rights laws are unnecessary to assist minorities. They actually can harm minorities. They also harm the rest of us. We should get rid of them. They can't be fixed. This was very predictable to anybody who used his or her head from the start that these things were enacted. It wasn't just that they were good laws that went bad. And even people like Alan Borovoy, who's sort of like, you know, the mainstream civil libertarian that newspapers always come to when they want to quote on civil liberties. Even Alan Borovoy is starting to have some regrets about how the human rights codes are acting, but won't come to the realization that they were wrong from their inception and there's no way to fix them. Okay, that's it.
Thanks, Karen. We just have a few minutes for some questions. And if you could come up a little, and I'll pass the mic as much as I can, so we can record this as well. Could you come up a little bit?
I'm not sure this question is worthy of being recorded, but
I just wanted to ask you, Karen, if the woman who called you an anti-Semite had gone to the Human Rights Council, how do you think you'd have done? I just haven't seen something that outrageous. So I thought, gee, I would almost finance her to take you to court to see how that one turned out, but not really.
I'm treating that as a rhetorical.
Karen, I would submit that reason number 10 that you're looking for would be that you're pulling all of the enforcement personnel out of productive activities and forcing society to pay for the loss of their productivity, plus the increasing conflict from all of their activities.
Okay, that's a good one.
10.
Yeah, that applies to almost every government activity.
I don't know if I can pass that.
No, but
There's one more group that you never mentioned, actually, that's increasingly getting a lot of rights, and that's prisoners. I'd just like to hear your comment on that. Not only prisoners, but criminals in general. I don't know if you're familiar with, a few days ago, the Gazette posted a story about a former murderer who was reinstated to his job because of the Quebec Superior Court. I'd just like to hear your comments on how, this is affecting prisoners and that type of people.
Was that under the human rights code?
Yep. No, the Quebec Charter. Conviction?
Haven't really given it much thought. I think that there is in the Ontario Human Rights Code something that talks about record of offences for which no pardon has been received. So yeah, you're not supposed to discriminate on the basis of. What do you say? Yeah, I'm not supposed to discriminate on the basis of that either. I mean, my own view is that you should be able to freely discriminate against someone who's got a criminal record. In fact, I would support publicizing criminal records as much as possible because I think that's one of the natural outcomes of committing a crime is that you should be ashamed of what you did, if it is a genuine crime. Not Mark, but if what you did was something that really hurt somebody, then one of the natural outcomes should be that you should face all the shame and reprobation that people of good sense would normally want to impose upon you. So I don't have a whole lot of sympathy with the criminals' rights and.
One of the early examples you mentioned about the rent, how they discriminate against income. What about for like millionaires or people that had saved up enough, wealth there to afford a luxury apartment or whatever, class of apartment these people are within, like elderly that are sort of using their savings. I know when you get old enough, they you figure out, well, I've got $200,000, and I figure if I spend $40,000 a year, and I only expect to last this long, you figure out your sort of monthly or yearly spending situation from that.
I'm not too sure what you're asking. There are certainly people who are quite wealthy but don't have any incomes, or at least show very little income because they're either working under the table or earning income that's somehow tax-free. So those people don't show any income, and I suppose they could be really rich and still fall under the protection of the Human Rights Commission. But I'm not sure whether I'm answering what you're asking.
Well, I guess you said that they discriminated on the amount of income they were currently bringing in. So if they had sort of saved up quite a bit of money and were using their savings to pay for the rent required to live in the place.
I would support the right of landlords to decide on any basis who they want to rent to. So if the landlord wants to question you about your income or wealth or source of income or source of wealth, and not rent to you on those grounds, like if the landlord didn't like the fact that Mark was selling marijuana seeds, like the landlord should be able to say, I won't rent to you. But that doesn't mean that Mark shouldn't be allowed to sell marijuana seeds if he wants to. Those are two separate things. So I would support.
That guy was going to Chinese landlord. If I could say that.
No.
Just your talk about how consumers are. Businesses can't discriminate against consumers, but consumers can discriminate against businesses. I'm just wondering if you're feeling guilty about giving the government new ideas.
I've written that in a number of different articles, and they've never taken me up on it. So no, I don't think that's very likely to happen.
Good question. About 2 or 3 years ago, I read about a case where a disc jockey in a radio station in Michigan was fired because he learned he had cancer, and the company didn't want to pay out benefits to him, so they terminated his employment. And I'm curious as to whether if that's something that there should be separate protection for, even if we were to eliminate the human rights legislation, because it seems to be kind of a cruel and unusual punishment. If you work for an employer for period of time, and you sign a contract with them, for these benefits as a part of your job, and then they go ahead and revoke them from you without any notice. I mean, it's in the court now, but I see a danger there. I mean, what your thought is on that?
Well, I certainly can feel sympathy with the person who had his contract terminated for that reason, but I guess that really is a question of contract. It's a matter for people to start, when they read about a case like that, start seriously thinking, let's see now, when I go to my next employer and start negotiating over the terms of this job, should I be saying, I want a benefit plan that can't be pulled in the event that I get sick? And certainly there's all different types of benefit plans. Generally speaking, when you buy insurance, the insurance company is not allowed to suddenly cancel you when the event happens that you've insured against. So I'm kind of, if you buy fire insurance and you've had one fire, they have to pay off, and then they may say, well, you're too much of a risk, we don't want your business again. But they certainly can't say, well, if the event that we insured you against has happened, we're pulling your insurance now and we're not paying anymore. So I can see that might be a valid question of what the contract really said. I'm not sure whether the employer was being dictated to by his benefit plan, or whether the employer just sort of decided to do that on his own, because I'd have to know more details, really.
My understanding is that he lost his job and the benefits. I mean, just because that you're going to get sick, you will likely die. We don't want to pay for your benefits because you can't continue your employment with us.
Well, I suppose so. I guess if the plan only covered people who were employees, and the employer said, I'm firing you, you've got cancer, then that's what the plan covered. I would think that, I know that there are certain types of benefit plans that continue on even after the person has left. So there are a lot of benefit plans that carry on after a person has retired and allow you to convert life insurance into a private policy, or allow you to carry on your benefit plan if you want to pay privately. And I guess it's really just a question of employers, if they feel that, that it's really unfortunate, not only did I have to fire this guy because he can't do his job because he has cancer, or I don't let people around with cancer because I think it's contagious or something. Whatever the employer had the right to terminate the contract, presumably, unless they had contracted for some period of time longer than what the employer did. But maybe the employer, if he thinks that it's really unfortunate that he also lost his benefits, should start looking around for a benefit carrier who will provide a policy that says, and we will continue, so